So how you doing? We're coming at you today with lots of stuff, but this is the beginnings of a big movement, and so it's time to get our knowledge down and our energy up. I'm really delighted to greet you, the movers and shakers, the citizen activists, the people who helped build this movement that we are now dubbing the new populism. Now, why do we call it populism? I want to step back here a little bit and provide a context. The Princeton Dictionary defines populism as a political doctrine that supports the rights and powers of the common people in their struggle with the privileged elite. Supports the common people in their struggle with the privileged elite. That's not a bad definition for Princeton. The new populism is founded, as Keith Ellison has told us, on the undeniable reality of today's America, that too few people control too much power and too much money, and they use that control to rig the rules to protect their privileges. And the question is, the challenge of populism is whether the common people can, in their struggle, take back the democracy from that privileged elite. Now, the simple reality is this economy does not work for working people. Economists measure this stuff. They'll tell you that for 70% of Americans, there's been wage stagnation through the entirety of this century. 70% of Americans are going nowhere. In the last years coming out of the Great Recession, the top 1% captured 95% of the income gains of the entire society. 1%, 95% of the income gains. This thing is askew. It's not an accident. It's not an act of nature. It's not due to technology or to globalization. It is rather a set of policies. Decades of deregulation, of top-end tax cuts, as Frank talked about, of soaring CEO pay, of the assault on workers and unions, of conservative myths, of market fundamentalism, has led to this age of Gilded Age extreme. And what's emerging, as Congressman Ellison said, is the beginnings of a plutocracy, and a plutocracy that does what plutocrats always do, uses their power to consolidate their gains. Now, what's interesting about America, what's promising about this moment, is Americans historically do not easily abide entrenched aristocracies. From the beginnings of the Republic, from the founders, there has been a suspicion of anything that would keep the opportunity from being widely shared. It was Jefferson who warned that we had to crush his verb, the moneyed corporate aristocracy that he thought was being formed at the time. And the movement that gave populism its name came out of the plains, came out of the Midwest, out of Kansas, etc., at the end of the 19th century. It was formed by small farmers and by workers, by day laborers, by sharecroppers, who came together against all the odds to take on the biggest trusts, the railroads, the distant banks that were making it impossible for them to survive. Now, they railed against government. They saw that a government handed the lands to the railroads. They protected and coddled the monopolies. They cracked the heads of workers that were trying to organize. But they made one fundamental understanding that the Tea Partiers today don't get. They realized they couldn't simply dismantle government and cut its powers, because if they did that, then the monopolies and the trusts and the banks would have a freer hand to gouge them and their neighbors. They had to do something far harder. They had to make government not an arm of the privileged, but an ally of the people. So that meant they had to figure out how to mobilize people to take on what Roosevelt later called organized money. It was Mary Elizabeth Lease, the great populist orator, who said it was time to raise less corn and more hell. But they realized protest wasn't enough. They had to come up with new ideas, with policies, with an agenda that would transform the rules of the game so that it could work for working people and for small farmers and for small business. Now, that populist movement as a party, the People's Party, lasted only a few years. But it set an agenda that set the progressive agenda for over 75 years. The minimum wage, the 8-hour day, the right to organize, the progressive income tax, the crackdown with antitrust on monopolies, the assault on corporate subsidies and crony capitalism, the attempt to extend democracy, direct election of senators, the initiative in the referendum, taking on big money in politics. There is a direct line from the platform of the 1892 Omaha meeting of the People's Party to the progressive movement, to Teddy Roosevelt, to FDR and the Economic Bill of Rights, and to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which we celebrate the 50th anniversary of this week. This is the legacy and the history on which the new populism stands. Now, you hear conservatives say, well, this is about envy, right? You got all these rich people, people envy them. It's not about envy. Americans actually don't care if rich people get really rich. They sort of like it. They think maybe they got a shot at it. This is about justice. It's about opportunity. It's about making sure that the game's not so rigged that the doors are shut for anyone else to get into it, so that the economy doesn't work for the majority, it only works for the few. And what we understand now, what's so blatant now, and what people are coming to understand, is that this game, in fact, is fixed, and the deck, in fact, is stacked. We see billionaires like Sheldon Anderson gathering Republican presidential nominees and treating them like sort of toy plastic soldiers that he can toy with as he decides who he's going to pick as his champion. As Frank said, we see millionaires paying lower taxes than their chauffeurs. We see multinationals stashing profits abroad and paying lower taxes than mom and pop businesses. It is, as hotel magnate Leona Helmsley said famously years ago, well, taxes are for little people. And we see CEO salaries. IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies, has just released a study showing that 40% of CEOs in the top 25 companies with the biggest incomes over the last years have pocketed multi-million-dollar bonuses, even though for 40% of them, their companies were either busted for violating the law, they were booted because they were failures and still got the bonuses, and yet this process of CEO pay soaring and worker pay declining continues. We see the Wall Street bankers. These are the folks who blew up the economy with their excesses and got bailed out. And now they're back. They're pretending to be masters of the universe again. They've reopened the financial casino, and they seem to be clear that they are immune from any prosecution for what the FBI called an epidemic of fraud that they profited from. Jail, after all, is for little people. So what does it take to take this all on? It gets to be forbidding when you think about the power arrayed against us. Yes, mobilized people have to take on organized money. And the politics and the agenda of our time has to change. Keith Ellison laid out some of the agenda of the Progressive Caucus budget, the idea that you can pay for the investments we need to solve the public squalor that we now wallow in by taxing and ensuring that the rich and corporations pay their fair share of taxes. But redistribution isn't enough. We've got to change the rules of the economy. We have to expand shared security, not cut it back. We have to make work pay, empowering workers, lifting the floor, patching the roof, putting a lid on CEO extremes. We have to curb Wall Street speculation and make banking boring again. We have to balance trade, and more. All of this is essential to a deal. You're going to hear a lot about this agenda today. But these ideas have to be central to organizing a popular movement that has the scope to be able to actually make a difference. Now, as Frank said, what's interesting is the American people get it. We are releasing a report today on the populist majority. It's on our website, populistmajority.org, that lays out a simple fact. On issue after issue after issue, vast majorities of Americans are with us. Citizens United, big money in politics, 4 out of 5 Americans want it repealed. 3 out of 4 Republicans. Minimum wage, overwhelming majorities. You care about free trade or fair trade, Americans overwhelmingly want fair trade. You care about fair taxes on the rich, as Frank just told you. They are ready. Curb Wall Street. Goldman Sachs' Lloyd Blankfein says that Goldman Sachs does God's work. But if you ask Americans, they think it's much more the devil's workshop. Protect Social Security and Medicare. Even majorities of Tea Partiers agree with that. So this populism is not, it has a popular grounding. It is grounded in where people's attitudes are already, in a sense, before the politics has even begun. And we don't have to invent it. It's here, it's happening now. It's already stirring. It's Occupy in 160 cities, putting inequality at the center of our political debate. It's exploited low-wage workers, as Keith talked about, protesting fast food restaurants across the country. It's a left-right congressional coalition that's coming together to oppose Fast Track and the Trans-Pacific Trade Accord. It's the Moral Monday protests that you'll hear about from Reverend Barber, who have challenged the assault on voting rights and on the vulnerable in North Carolina, and now are spreading to Georgia and to South Carolina. It's a feisty citizens organization that is opposing the big oil companies as they try to take over the rights to frack their land. You can see it in the culture. We now have a pope who condemns, quote, the modern idolatry of money, unquote, and condemns those who believe, quote, in the tyranny of unfettered capital. You can see it on the bestseller lists. Can you imagine an obscure French economist writing a 685-page book about income inequality and having it soar to the top of the list right next to Danielle Steele's steamy new novel? Something is moving here. And forceful leaders are emerging. You're going to hear from some of them today. Sherrod Brown, an extraordinary champion of working people out of Ohio. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. You've heard from Keith Ellison. Across the country, populist mayors are being elected, led by New York's Mayor Bill de Blasio, who ran in New York, talking about a tale of two cities and demanding the right to raise taxes on the rich to pay for universal pre-K for every child. And what's interesting to me is we are much stronger than people think. The entire base of the Obama majority, the rising American electorate, people of color, single women, the millennials, they have fared the worst in this economy. And more they are demanding changes so that it works for them. It is not an accident that senators have adopted Elizabeth Warren's call to raise taxes on millionaires to be able to renegotiate the debts of students that have graduated so that they can pay at least closer to an affordable interest rate. At the organized base of the party, from unions to community activists, they are ready. So the question for us is not something we have to invent, not something that we have to create. It's simply, we've got to start to organize. So today, we'll report on that majority. You'll hear leaders from this movement. We'll talk about the fundamental reforms that have to be taken. And will start down this road. Now, we're going to have an election. People say conservatives are going to win because Democrats are discouraged and there's going to be a low turnout. But you should understand, this has only started. This is not about one election. It's not about one leader. This is going to take a long time, and we're going to have to keep building. It will take muckraking and organizing and teaching and protests and new ideas and new allies. It will face fierce resistance. It's against the odds. The wealthy and the powerful spend lavishly to defend their privileges. And our entire system really is designed to clog change, not facilitate it. But as Keith said, when people actually speak, politicians start to listen. And we've only just begun to build. And the stakes truly are fundamental. We are in an historic project. And the question is whether the democracy, in fact, can reclaim the country from an emerging and entrenched elite. This is a project worth devoting energy, ideas, lives to. It's one we have to start, and let's get on it. Thank you.